the consciousness of the body. Originally, each of you were light entities and light beings, and you wished to go into physicality and live in this expression here. You wished to live among the things that you had been creating, visiting, and seeing. You began designing and creating embodiments that would allow you to live here biologically as one of the creations on the planet. During the primitive state of the planet, you began to develop your future embodiment. In the same way as a child's body matures into an adult embodiment, so too the species had to develop from a primitive instinctual state into one that could hold the totality of your consciousness as light entities within them. Biologically, you began to create embodiments that would literally hold you in physicality, allow you to experience here, to share the sensory perceptions that this planet offers, and to enjoy life in this expression. Ever since, the body has been going through its own development to evolve it into a species that would be able to hold a full fledged God within it. Originally, the body was just a mass of elements from your planet in different combinations. To begin with, the body didn't have any more consciousness than a plant or anything else. Each species began to grow its own consciousness, and in that primal stage, it was just cellular division. Dividing the cellular structure was the limit of the consciousness. Originally, the body or cellular mass could not Originally, the body or cellular mass could do no more than recreate itself. From that point, it evolved the survival instincts of animal behavior so that it knew how to preserve itself. Eventually, as it began to evolve and grow, it was stimulated through emotions and through feelings that were added down the line when the light beings you are began inhabiting them. Outside of the embodiment, you are each beauteous and have the ability to breathe life into anything you do. When you began to merge into the biology of the physical beings you were creating and began sharing in this experience, it created a synergy that began to put life into proportions of the embodiment. You put feeling tone in it. This created an emotional body out of it, but it also allowed the body to feel that it was somewhat alive. The body began to become much more animated. It had much greater freedom of movement, and it could now function in a whole different perspective. The light consciousness that you were wanted to be able to express in physicality and be conscious of that state. But the biological embodiment at that time was not able to allow you a full conscious connection with it. So, as you were recreating the brain system to hold you, you also began to restructure the solar plexus and the entire feeling and emotional centers in order to handle biologically what you were as light beings. You did this because you wanted to be able to embrace the totality of this planet. This recreation of your brain and feeling centers began to evolve the species much faster. As it evolved, the biological embodiment began to think to itself to be conscious and alive. The consciousness really belonged to the light entity that was sharing its perceptions, but now the body thought it was conscious. When the light entity was put together with the body, the entity became the consciousness and the body became the vehicle. In their synergy, the body moved into its own particular movement and reactions to life. The body didn't know that it was sharing and thought that the consciousness was its own. It began to think it was alive. It started to see itself as that consciousness because it didn't realize that there was anything outside of itself. This is when the body actually began to develop its own consciousness from the consciousness of the light entity. Because it thought it was all the same package, it began to create the images for the light embodiment to manifest into. The light entities that you were had become so entwined through the entire body mind system that you resonated with that body. You were such a part of the body that as soon as your light was gone, the body thought itself to be dead and would create physical death for itself. It perceived that its consciousness was gone and it no longer felt alive. The body had become so dependent upon your own light that in its absence it would revert to its own lifeless, unanimated form that it was before the light entity was inhabiting it. The body began to be aware of what was going on because you, the light entity, was beginning to understand it yourself. Anything that the light entity understands through the body, the physical embodiment assumes as a portion of its own consciousness and can use it as its own. The body is still biologically evolving, and when you love it into existence, it will live forever. There will be no death process, and the body will be a living entity. Now, it is a cellular mass, a biological species that is run by the light that you are. You give it life, but as soon as you allow the body to move into its own consciousness and evolve its connection with yours, the body will move into full animation and will be a fully alive species. The body, in the process of all this, began to understand emotions a little. It began to understand some of the various charges it was getting from the different things that were happening to it. It didn't understand where it was all coming from. It didn't know where the consciousness was. It didn't know that it was both a physical and a spiritual being. All it knew was that it was beginning to feel some form of consciousness. It realized that it was thinking. As it started to think and feel, it also wanted to know who and what it was. To answer these questions, the body started creating its own images. This is where your original images that all of you deal with came from. You see, the light entities that you are so fleeting in your thought that you can move a mile a minute. The body was too slow and cumbersome for you. Since you were sharing with the biological being, every thought that you had was telling the body it had to shift or change in order to match it. As light entities in these bodies, every time you change your thought about what you are or what you are not, you actually change the direction for the whole body. A light entity thinks, and whatever they think is created. No desire, light won't move. Whatever they project in thought will be created and manifested for them, but the physical embodiment cannot work the same way. After the light being and the embodiment came together and the body started to think it was conscious, the light entities would think different things about themselves in consciousness. It was like playing games with yourself in consciousness, imagining yourselves in different roles and using different faces. Each time you would do this, the body would shift in order to create the image you were holding. You would look at the different bodies and think, well, if I had a different model, I could do it a different way. If I had different legs, I could run faster. If I had a different face, I could look different. If I had a different coloration or different color eyes, I might like it better. As light entities, you were very creative. And at that time, you were not as tied into these bodies as you are now. And you allowed your minds to explore these different possibilities at a mile a minute. The whole time, the body was trying to keep up with you and to evolve into what you were envisioning. The body was not capable of the quantum changes that you, the entity, was. It was an evolving biological entity, evolving within a time space medium, and it took time to change. The biological species was so slow in its evolution, the light entity had to find something to entertain itself with, so it merely enjoyed seeing itself in all these different embodiments, lives, and experiences it could create. But since the body and the entity were now somewhat connected, the body thought that all these perceptions were its own. The body began to feel that these were all the things that it was supposed to be. Originally, when you first began your connection with these embodiments, you put in an evolutionary path for them so that they would evolve at a more rapid rate. Your children, for example, grow into adults because they were given an imprint within their cellular structure to become adults. So, too, you gave a life path to these embodiments that you were playing with. You would merge with it and give it a direction to grow in order to hold the totality of you and be one entity. If it was given the path and allowed to follow that path, it accelerated the evolution of the body and its consciousness. But because the embodiments and brains were so unbearably slow to the entities, they never completely merged. In the meantime, the entities' minds were running off 100 different perspectives of directions. So instead of getting a biological embodiment that would normally just evolve according to one plan, you have all these embodiments trying to create the thoughts of the entities in all these different images in which they saw themselves. Let's say the light entity is only feeding the biological embodiment a dozen different visions of itself. And many of these entities were feeding a whole lot more than 12 images of themselves. Now you have a biological embodiment picking up on that and trying to create every one of them. But it doesn't know how to do it because it must work through time. This creates a grand conflict within the embodiment. So it pulls in one thought of the entity and tries to create that. Then the next thought comes in and it tries to create that. It keeps changing. And this is how disease was built in these embodiments. As the biological embodiment would try to change to match the thought of the light entity, it would set a whole cellular response in motion in order to grow according to the thought that it perceived to be its journey, the direction that it was supposed to go. But it had so many signals and directions that it genetically started setting itself on many courses that were not compatible. The light entity did not realize the embodiment was putting life into all its thoughts, but it is the nature of the light entity's thought process to put life into all of its thoughts. The biological being has now been set on multiple courses. The life of each idea tries to create the embodiment in a different direction. Molecularly and cellularly, each of those is already started into movement and become part of the evolutionary process. It is a disharmony in the organism. And you have diseasement for the first time in the body. This happened because the light entities couldn't focus on what direction they truly wanted to go. Willlessness. Prior to this, biological being was evolving extremely rapidly by any standard. Now it was beginning to slow down because it was diseasing and conflicting within itself. Since at this time it was still a primitive vehicle, anything that would cause an overload would shut it down. The conflicting signals and directions had confused it. It didn't know what to do, so it shut down and would not evolve. The body had tasted the love and joy of the light entity, and it craved that life force. It had to have that, but it didn't know how to get it. It went within its own being and used its own primitive consciousness to try to form an image of what it was supposed to become. It would feel the consciousness of the light entity and try to create a composite picture of the light entity and what the light entity wanted. The biological embodiment would then take this picture and say, "This is what I am. This is what I am supposed to be." It used that composite for its image to grow into. It would say, "This is how my biological being is supposed to be, because this is what consciousness says I am." Some of you today on this planet are still living out evolutionary processes that were put in motion eons ago by your progenitors. Whatever image was settled on was a statement to the biological being to create the physical genetics to match that image. Many individuals are still living out of their genetic structure. The biology continues to try to fulfill that whole image it embraced years ago. This is when the original image began. When the biology settled at last on an image, it gained an increased sense of identity and consciousness, which accelerated its evolution once more. Again, the light entity and the biology were able to come closer together. The closer the entity can come to the biology, the more life it gives to the embodiment. The light entity puts life into anything it touches, and it will live in a whole animated form. At this point in time, the light entity was merging more fully with the biological being, but it was also being trapped by the images in the genetic structure. The light entity hadn't understood what had happened. It didn't realize the grand respect, almost worship, that the body had for it. The consciousness that was forming in the body tried to create everything that the entity thought. It didn't see the entity as separate from it at this time. It assumed that it was its own consciousness, and out of its great love and respect for it, it determined to create and be everything that had ever been thought through that consciousness. These embodiments are working from survival behavior. That means that whatever they need to create or recreate will be genetically encoded as part of the evolution of the species. If the entity is off playing in other realms and experiencing the non physical, the biology can't understand all that. Whatever the entity thinks of biologically or physically, it will create. Its intent is to maintain and become all that, for that is what it considers to be its direction. Whatever you, the entity living in these bodies, feel about them or think about them, back as far as your generations go, actually goes into your cellular genetics to alter and change this body to match the thought of the entity. This is basic survival behavior. It is what your bodies were designed to do. The light entities become a little impatient waiting for them to evolve and catch up with them. They didn't realize what they were doing to the whole species. And now you light entities come into them, get stuck, and sit and curse them while they are not living up to your image or expectations of them. The body is now trying to move into a new perspective of evolution. It's beginning to understand consciousness. The entity is now a cross between a light entity and the biological being, and most of the thought processes that go through your heads are associated with the biology or physical existence. So you have a biological body trying to live up to the physical expectations of the hybrid entity that now inhabits it. Those expectations are what it sees as necessary for it to evolve. Understand that the entity you are is not totally within the embodiment, but surrounds it at all times. This means that the image that you hold for your embodiment is also contained out in your field, the area surrounding your body. This field we call your mind. It is your non physical mind. This is what holds the image for the evolution of the body. Most of you upon your plane spend most of your time worrying about physical existence, and this is what keeps you dense. You spend most of your time dealing with the day to day physical life, and this is what you are feeding these bodies to have them evolve too. The more you allow the body to evolve into light or into a grander expanse of what it can be, the more you accelerate its evolutionary process. But this hasn't happened for some time. It is starting to shift now, but for the longest period, your planet has been rutting in the focus of the physical existence. Non physical reality was unheard of. Now you have physical embodiments that you are trying to evolve into light. These embodiments are fearful of that because they haven't known what light is and you haven't been telling them. They didn't realize that the light entity is what has been evolving them all this time, what has been living with them, and what gave them a consciousness to begin with. They are beginning to realize that you are intending to evolve them into a much more expanded form to be able to live with them in both the physical and non physical worlds. A lot of you on this plane now and your various paths and disciplines are trying to promote your physical embodiments into expanded and spiritual perspectives. This will take a little time because you are showing them something that is so nebulous that the body isn't able to hold an image of it in order to grow into it. The biological body must hold an image of something if it is to grow into it. All of you are trying to grow into the non physical, even if you are not in conscious pursuit of it, because all of you on this plane are always seeking death. Even when you are trying to enjoy life, you are usually planning for death or for the world hereafter. But your ideas are nebulous about it. The only real spiritual image you've been holding for your body to grow into is that it must die. So your whole life you prepare to lay it down. When you are in this perspective, it's not going to evolve very rapidly. As you begin to understand that perhaps you don't have to lay the body down, you start trying to move the embodiment into spirit and expanded perspectives. Most of you don't know what this means or what is out there waiting for you. You still cannot hold an image or ideal for the body to grow into. That is why you can really understand a concept like ascension. That understanding actually holds an ideal that the body can grow to match. Your understandings so far have been very limited. What you hold are pseudo images or ideals. The body, for quite a few generations now, has been bulking at the unclear directions of its entity. It sits in the same old ruts because it doesn't know where to go. It has virtually lived out every image that the original light entity put in it. It is at an evolutionary crossroads. It is capable of evolving into a whole different perspective, but it needs input. Anything you embrace about you as an image, it will create for you. But you entities living in these bodies are not embracing your own physical and non physical nature, and you're not giving the embodiments their new direction, desire. Without that direction, these bodies are just going to pass around the same old images. Your bodies have to have a blueprint to grow into or to live up to. But you, as light entities, don't even hold a vision of life for these bodies. You wish you could get out of them or wish you had a different one. So the body is going to find its own images and it will get them out of social consciousness because it knows it's okay there. It knows how to function in society. If you, as the entity, will not give it an ideal to evolve into, it will find its own because it needs one for its own survival. Because you have not consciously been trying to direct the development of the body, the embodiment had to provide itself with its own survival consciousness. The bodies have been developing their own consciousness because the light entities weren't paying enough attention to them. Your social images in this plane have become your prime survival instinct for these bodies. You have to match the image. You have to have something to live up to. And whatever you are is never good enough because the moment you do not get good enough, the body ceases to evolve. But long ago, you built into these bodies that they must evolve, so the body will find an image, one place or another. Because you're not telling them what to be, they will try to live up to somebody else's expectations. In the consciousness that these embodiments are developing, they have learned how to access your field or non physical mind in order to feed themselves the images they need. When you are around other people, it will access their images and start living them because you, the entity, are not giving them a picture of their own perfection. Your fields are quite flexible and a lot bigger than most of you think. These bodies have learned how to use your field to create and access gestalts. All the body wants is for this light entity it adores to give it some direction, but for the longest time it has been ignored. So it creates these gestalts or coagulations of images to substitute for the direction that the light entity is not giving it. The body has to have an image to live up to, and your social gestalts are always willing to provide one. Unless you give your body an image to live up to, it will always try to match someone else's expectation. All the time, you are all telling yourself that your images aren't good enough. Nothing's ever good enough about most of you on this planet. You are always running yourselves down. You never look right. You never feel right. You never act right. You're always looking and striving for something different. That tells your embodiment, do not accept anything I send you. Go seek for something else. So it does. And it goes out through your field and pulls in other people's images and tries to live up to them. In the earlier days of this planet, when you as light entities were just beginning to overlay these embodiments, your planet had a fairly pure atmosphere and gravitation. What you term your atmosphere and your gravity is created out of the prevailing attitude of consciousness on the planet. When you created this planet, you gave it a very beauteous atmosphere. Your whole attitude was very synergistic with life. The attitude of every species on the planet was one of harmony and one that perpetuated life. The whole planet was one consciousness, what we will call a pure or unadulterated consciousness. The consciousness of any species living on the planet then was one of life and joy. Everything, including the primal human species, lived with this atmosphere around them. The entire planet lived in joy, life, and harmony. There was no diseasement and there was no death. When the biological embodiments learned to access your mind, that also gave them access to the entire mass consciousness of the planet. Up to that time, each species just had its portion of mass consciousness. When these embodiments accessed through your minds into mass consciousness, in their efforts to find images, it changed the entire consciousness constructs for the planet. You had these light entities running around in biological embodiments. Anything that any one of them was doing in a physical body affected the entire consciousness. Because they were in a physical body, they were out of harmony with their natural state, but they were still light entities that gave life to everything they thought or touched. This is when your diseases in these embodiments began. It is also when the embodiment started seeking other images. And in doing that, it actually attached itself to the atmosphere of this planet, which is what began to create the Gestalts here. At this time, the individual biological entities started putting out gestalts or images around themselves in order for them to have a story to evolve to. The embodiments had to have a story to grow into, so they created one. The original Gestalt was just a story the biological being was creating for itself to evolve to. When it did this, however, it also imprinted that image into the atmosphere and therefore into every other species on the planet. That is when everything, including your planet and animal kingdoms, began creating death. Prior to that time, nothing died. Your trees, your plants, your animals didn't even know disease. This is where some of your stories about this planet being a grand paradise in its early days came from. It was a paradise for a long time. It lasted until your embodiments began creating their own images and gestalts. Now, these gestalts were just strong coagulations of similar images in this pure atmosphere. They attached to it so that it was no longer pure joy and pure life. Prior to this, all of your life forms had the ability to access this pure, free flowing consciousness to have the connection they needed for life. When they sought that connection, all your plants and animals started running into these gestalts that the biological human species had been creating for its story. These images and pseudo life forms taught your animals to behave almost like the human species. They taught them to evolve differently, how to create disease and how to create death. About this time, the light entities started realizing what was going on. They had shifted their focus for a while and had been off in all these other realms playing. So they brought their attention back and focused more intently on the embodiments to evolve them more rapidly for themselves. All of you now are still experiencing the direction and intensity of this focus to evolve. It was going to be a little harder than the light entities had thought. Some of these images that the body had picked up by this time were so strong and so burdensome that the light entity felt that the only way to get rid of the image was to lay the body down and pick up a new one. Hopefully the new embodiment would have different images that it could evolve it through. They still didn't realize that the embodiments held in their genetic structure everything that the light entities had ever thought, and that it was the body's intent to create it all. For a period of time, there was a grand decline in the consciousness levels and evolution of the embodiment. You became intensely focused on the embodiment and gave life to everything that the body had perceived to be the direction it was supposed to go. As you actually lived in all these different directions and images, it became too burdensome. And you created the death process so that you could pick up another body. You hoped that succeeding generations would have fewer images as the images were lived out and the bodies laid down. In the beginning, the death process took thousands of years, but you rapidly moved it into occurring every few years to speed the evolution. The life expectancy at one point was under 20 years because you wanted to lay them down as fast as possible and hoped that you laid the images down with them. Since that time, you have lengthened the lifespan again in order to give you each, if you used it, more time to evolve these embodiments. The embodiment is finally ready to hold a whole identity. The embodiment is finally ready to hold a whole entity, the entire brain system, and several other features that are needed to hold that entity that you are finally grown within these embodiments. Biologically, these bodies could hold you now, but they have to be activated. There are portions of the brain that you have been using elsewhere that need to start coming online here. You are actually going to move more fully into these bodies and give them full life. Right now, the body still thinks it has its own consciousness and that there is a kind of tug of war going on between you. But these bodies are becoming conscious enough that they can function somewhat even when you are not in them. Also, now the biological image of the embodiment survives the death process to some extent, even though the light entity goes on to a different perspective. At this present point in time, you are learning to live fully in these bodies. You are creating them to be a whole living entity. As the light entities that you are in a position now, as you yourselves become more fully awake and aware, to take this body and add a few finishing touches and transform it into a vehicle to hold the totality of you. Originally, that was the dream of this universe. That was one of your primary reasons for coming here. You each wanted to have a vehicle or embodiment that would fully house a complete whole God. You wanted to be able to live in it, to express it, to feel, to enjoy, and to have all of the sensory perceptions. You wanted to be able to use these things to interpret everything else you experienced anywhere. In an expanded consciousness and in other states of reality outside of this one, each individual has a core, a central area within which they can create, experience, and interpret everything through. Being the young gods that you were did not mean that you did not have such a core, but you each wanted an individualized one. These embodiments will allow you to have your own medium to interpret every experience you ever have. That is why the body is so important and so valuable. You came here to this universe to pick one up and call it your own. In your older generations of consciousness, and not from a principle of hierarchy, but in the realms that existed before this one, each of them have their own embracement vehicle through which they can experience and interpret everything they ever experience. Now, each of you have an embracement vehicle as well. Physical existence was your way of getting one. As the gods you are, you designed these bodies to be that for you, and you will keep coming back to them until you have evolved one that you can take with you. When these bodies are fully functioning, they are capable of interpreting any experience you will ever have in any reality, literally and in every aspect of the experience. There is more in that statement than you are able to appreciate at this time. These bodies will have a treasure beyond your comprehension. In the meantime, you are putting consciousness in the embodiment so that eventually these bodies will be a living consciousnesses in and of themselves, working fully and compatibly with yours. This body is at a point of evolution where all this can be realized, but you have to be able to move into your feeling tones to teach and evolve it. It is the last leg of the journey and the most challenging. The more you move into your feelings, and that is what you are all doing, you are literally giving consciousness to the biological being. But until you get this embodiment to a point of being a living consciousness of its own, you're going to run into a transitional pattern in your evolution. That portion of you that perceives pain, rejection, loneliness, the portion that deals with these types of attitudes in this plane is going to be very sensitive as you move into your feelings. This is coming out of the portion of the consciousness of the body whose function it is to monitor how it feels about itself. And now this portion is becoming alive. The whole body is becoming a living consciousness. So it is going to react to its genetic patterning and to any physical stimulus at all. And it is scared half to death. You're putting consciousness in something that previously wasn't conscious. The body is becoming more aware because the light entity is. The body is becoming more sensitive and vulnerable. All of the attitudes that you don't like to deal with are coming out of the consciousness of the body and are going to start surfacing. A long time ago, this embodiment learned how to deal with minds. It learned how to use your mind to connect with images. It knows how to play the Gestalt game. And now, as it becomes more aware of itself, it will perceive the slightest influence from any of these Gestalts. Some of your first awarenesses on this planet are going to come through the consciousness of the body, and they may be a little painful. The body learned to access the mind on its own before you, as the light entities, could evolve it to that point. It knows how to perceive energies. It understands levels of consciousness, and it knows when and what to accept and what not to. It had to learn to because it wanted to live. And it had to have an image to grow into. And you, the light entities, were not giving it one. Now, as it is becoming more aware, because you are, it moves into a greater sensitivity to the influence from these realms. That portion of you that can feel rejected or hurt, that portion that is open to all these types of feelings is going to become more and more sensitive as the body becomes more conscious. The biology evolves in stages, so it is not going to be a constant thing. You may think that you've gone through it, but it is likely to resurface each time the body becomes awake for a time, and you're going to go through a period of sensitivity. Understand that in consciousness, the light entity has every gift that any of you ever seek. You already know how to use them, but you are trying to teach the biological embodiment these things. All of your gifts, your psychic abilities, and non physical sight must all come through the consciousness of the body as it evolves along its path toward holding a full fledged God within it. Left to our own devices, these biological embodiments evolve at such a slow rate that it would be eons down the road before they would be at the place you wish them to be. This is reflected in your children. The human species is one of the slowest to mature on the planet, and for a long time, they are unable to fend for themselves. This is because your embodiments are one of the latest species added to the planet. The species that were here before you, living in the uncorrupted atmosphere, evolved at a much faster rate. The rate at which your offspring mature reflects that rate of evolution. Your embodiments are of recent advent to planet Earth, Plan ET, and they have been evolving very slowly. That is why your children grow so slowly in their early years. It is what keeps them dependent for so long. This entire lengthy process of the evolution of the consciousness of the body is what is behind every dependency issue that you or this planet ever had. On one level, you realize this. Your entire medical profession is actually trying to accelerate the evolution of these embodiments. When the embodiment becomes diseased, it means that it is trying to go too many directions at one time. So, in many instances, the medical profession literally cuts out unwanted directions or images through surgery. A lot of the prescriptions, drugs, and techniques that your doctors are using work on the body in an entirely different perspective than what you understand. In most cases, these things allow the light entity that you are to come into a more singular focus within the body. You see, every time the body goes into disease or disharmony, you have to focus upon it because you care about it. You give it self attention. When you do that, what you are really doing is focusing back into the embodiment and how you want it to be. If you are sick at the time, your focus holds a vision of it not having the illness, getting rid of it. Your medical profession is a system created to help you focus back into your embodiment. You need to focus back on your body more, but you don't know exactly how. So your body helps you out through illness. When you have a cold, for example, you wish you didn't. And so you hold an image of yourself being free of the cold. That actually holds you in a different image to allow the body to evolve into. In many cases, the medical profession helps to eliminate certain images or structures that are hindering the evolution of the body so that a more singular focus can be created. Each of you need to realize that while these embodiments may seem like a limitation to you, they are not necessarily a limitation in the way you perceive them to be. See them rather as your own children, your own child. You love your children. They slow you down, they holler at you when you are in the supermarket. They want a lot of attention, but you still love them. If you could give the same kind of consideration to these embodiments, you'd get along a lot better, a lot easier, and you'd evolve them at a much faster rate. By the consciousness perspective of the light entity that you are, these embodiments are juvenile. Your consciousness is so expanded that the embodiment is a real limitation to you, but they don't have to be. Just realize that you came into them for a reason. You are loving them into existence. You are allowing the whole body to become a living mind, entirely awake and alert, so evolved in its own right that it is sensitive to everything in existence. You start loving these bodies into existence when you come to peace with them, loving you just the way you are, loving you completely, relaxing and allowing your images to drop is a whole lot easier than surgery. Besides, if you are the God living in this body and you keep adding new images, that's what you are telling the body to be. You won't be teaching it to live forever. You won't be teaching it to evolve in consciousness. All you'll be doing is seeing the body as a prison, and you'll use your fantasies and your images to entertain you until you decide to get out. Be friends with your body, respect it. Genetically speaking, its roots go back eons farther than yours. Remember that all on its own, while you were playing your games in other realms, it chose to live. It loves you as the God of its being. You are literally creating it now into your ultimate expression, your grandest creation. When you are done with them, these biological embodiments are going to be the synergy of your living mind and living consciousness. They will be the entire interpretive mechanism that you will use in every consciousness experience that you will ever have anywhere. These embodiments are more valuable to you spiritually than these brains are to you physically. You are really much more valuable. They are really much more valuable. You came here in order to get an embracement vehicle, an embodiment. No one forced you to come. So come to peace with your bodies, no longer pushing new images upon them. Just allow them to be, loving them into existence. That loving into existence is going to come through a relaxed state as you put joy in them and in every aspect of your life. The body responds to joy. It is the ultimate body response that can be created. In spirit, there are other concepts and constructs that are grand and wonderful, but in the body, joy is the ultimate expression now. After joy, it can begin to understand the lessons of passion and other vibrations of life. But right now, joy is the grandest thing you can teach these bodies. Joy is the ultimate expression it can know here. Love your bodies. Put that joy in them and allow them to be your most joyous expression. And that is today's chapter. So thank you for being part of it today. Happy unboxing day to Robin as well. Amazing. And I want to say, you may be aware of my tattoo, and it's my logo, but it actually was inspired by Paprice. And I just want to read part of the reason that it inspired me to be the brand and something I got tattooed on myself about 10 years ago. Legends say that hummingbirds float free of time, carrying our hopes for love, joy, and celebration. The hummingbird's delicate grace reminds us that life is rich, Beauty is everywhere. Every personal connection has meaning, and that laughter is life's sweetest creation. So that was where the inspiration came from, and the fact my energy is a little bit like a hummingbird. So I move quick and I'm smallish, and so I'm in and out and doing my thing while I'm here. And so that was our thing today. It's been nearly 2 hours. So thank you for sticking around to play for as long as you did. It's been an absolute pleasure and blessing. Sean says, thanks for reading, Laura. Haven't had this since grade school. Right? Well, you know, I haven't either, to be fair, other than the audio programs that I tune into. But how wonderful is it to come together and to share it in common unity with other fabulous co-creators of the world that we are creating together. So thank you, Bruiser. Did you want to say anything before we go?
It's perfect timing because I actually got to head out here. But no, just thank you for hosting this. I still got a nice little gift card to Barnes and Noble that I still got to use. So I might have to get that book and just read that and for myself, and also look at like other related books here.
Yeah. Joyriding. This is the book, and I'm going to be reading a chapter of it every day. And if you won't find it at Barnes and Noble, but this series, oh shoot, and it's leftover water, which is the emotions. My cat's water's on the ground there. But this series is actually called the Right Use of Will series, and so I'm actually my fourth book is over by my bed, but the very first book, this is well worth investing into, Bruiser. It's by a woman named C.Anne. I haven't even opened this one yet. C.Anne de Rohan. So you actually get it from Four Winds Publishing, and you're in the States, so it'll be easier from a shipping perspective because this company is in the States too. But all 8 of these books take you on a journey into the will.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Right now, we're literally, our will is being attacked. That's the willlessness is Luciferian light turned on itself. And that's what this book is all about. It's about the 4 aspects of the father, which is awareness, body of manifestation, or father of manifestation, which is body. And then the will is the mother. And then heart is the child that acts as the bridge between awareness and will. So definitely recommend the Right Use of Will series. And the green one goes right in between here. So no, right in between here. But anyway, it's been a huge pleasure and gift to be with you today. So thank you. I'm going to get this posted and share it onto my YouTube channel. So if you would share it too, I appreciate that. And ultimately, I appreciate all your contributions. So thank you for showing up. Have a fantastic traditional Boxing Day or untraditional unboxing day, whatever you want to make today be. Choose to bring joy wherever you go, so you can break the trance of fear on the faces in all the places that you go. So have a good one. Thank you.
You as well. Thank you. Share that book series in the Telegram group, will you please?
Will do. Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Peace out until tomorrow, guys.
Right, bye-bye.
Walks away. Love it. Ciao for now, guys.